Hello and welcome to a lesson on the pre-industrial sport. So this is pre-1850 really. So we're looking at sport at the moment, and we're looking specifically at activities that were popular during this period of time. So in essence, we refer to that as popular recreation. And within this lesson, obviously, we need to be aware that during this period of time in society, we had two basic classes. So we had the upper class, referred to as the gentry, and we had the lower class, which was referred to the majority, which was the peasants. And in essence, what you need to recognise first and foremost is that there was a clear distinction between the two in regards to what they had and what they didn't have, and ultimately that obviously impacted on the types of sports and activities they would have participated in. So if we first and foremost just think about what some of the characteristics and features were during this period of time, so before 1850, and it's kind of like setting the scene in essence really, so that you're clear and you've got an understanding of what Britain used to look like. And I'm going to start with that bottom right hand one there in regards to rural society. So when we think of England in particular, but also Wales, Scotland and so on, we refer to that as Merry England. So by Merry England, we're talking about lots of greenery, lots of fields. If you think of maybe an island day, if you've ever had a chance to visit, it kind of looks a little bit like England, how it used to look like without all the major and the big cities and the big roads that exist today. So we had a very rural society. So people used to live out in the open. There was lots of obviously countryside, and obviously those kind of settlements, those houses were very much scattered, rather than sort of the big urbanized buildings that we see today, those urbanized settlements that we see today. I mentioned there about the two society classes. So we had the upper class, the gentry, and we had the lower classes, the peasants. On top of that, the fact it was a rural society and before 1850, we had limited transport. So in essence, in order to get around from place to place within the country, it was difficult because ultimately we didn't have trains, we didn't have cars at that particular stage. We would have had access to horses, we'd have had access to horse and carts, but ultimately we weren't able to move around from station to station, weren't able to move from location to location because of that limited transport routes. As well as that, we had the church, which played a big part in society at the time, and therefore the main sort of popular recreation games and festivals used to take place on religious days. So although the peasants had a fair bit of time to play their activities, it was during those religious festival days in particular, so it would have been Easter time in particular, where they would have taken part in some of these different festivals and activities and games. But ultimately, society was harsh. It was a tough it was a tough place to live in. And ultimately, as it was a tough place to live in regards to kind of law, we didn't really have a police force prior to, the 1850s. And it was ruled by mob in essence. It was ruled by the upper and the rich class in essence, and it was a bit of a dog eat dog kind of society. And that meant that obviously we had specific illnesses, we had specific diseases that obviously ran riot. We had tough conditions to live in, kind of poverty conditions really. It could have been dirty in places and whatnot as well. And ultimately that reflected on sport itself. So we're going to look a little bit later in regards to things like mob football. And it wouldn't have been uncommon for people to have died at those particular events, because ultimately we didn't have any rules at the time for a lot of these particular sports, especially for the lower classes. And why was that? Well, it was because we had an illiterate society. So a society that couldn't read, it couldn't write. And only the upper class only the gentry class had access to education. So that obviously meant that people didn't understand and couldn't formulate rules. So in essence, the rules that they did have in place were often were very hostile, were not catered for that safety element, as we will see. So, for your benefit, you need to be aware, obviously, in terms of the different types of sports. So, for the lower class, the peasants, we had things like mob games, such as mob football being the prime example. And then we had things like prize fighting, or bare fist knuckle fighting, as it relates to there. Whereas the gentry class, a much more sort of sophisticated group of people, they had more kind of lavish equipment, lavish facilities, and it was more civilized, it was more individualized in essence. So forms of sports such as lawn tennis, real tennis, and also cricket would have been kind of referred to as gentry or gentrified sports. Not only that, it would have been some activities and sports that would have replicated military influences, so such as archery, for example, that would have taken place within stately homes. If we look at the key features then, first and foremost, of mob games, so you can see here on this diagram, I've already talked about the fact that they were violent. So there were obviously people that would die. There'd have been various stampedes, there'd have been a huge, vast amount of people playing, 100, 200, up to 1,000 people playing, and it was chaotic. And in essence, obviously, it could turn violent. There were local variations. So within our rural society, each particular settlement, each particular village would have had their own set of rules of how they may be played that specific activity. So unlike we have today in, for example, the Premier League or in the NBA in terms of basketball, where we have a set of rules, that wouldn't have been the case in these mob games. We also had participation being among the males rather than the females. So it was very male dominated, these mob games. Ultimately, the men were referred to as the providers of the family, and women were, in essence, told to stay at home, to be that wife figure, to be that mother figure, where they would be doing the cooking and the cleaning. And as I said there, in terms of numbers, we at times would have had whole village participation in these mob games. We'd have had very limited equipment, limited facilities, so it may have just been a ball, it may have been a barrel of beer that would have been kicked around as part of a mob game, but in essence there had been very limited equipment. As I said before, it was an unlimited number of players, and these were played on occasional days. So these games would have been played specific to the church's request, in particular on these particular occasional days. And finally, sort of just what you need to know for the exam, really, you need to be aware of the social impacts. So how does class and gender, how does that impact on sport that was played pre-1850? How was the influence of transport or lack of transport? How did that influence, obviously, the type of activities that were played during this particular time? The same goes for education and literacy, as we kind of mentioned about the fact that the peasants couldn't read and write. Law and order, about the fact that we had limited law, we had limited order, which obviously had an impact on the type of rules that were played, especially in these mob games. How much money people had. Remember, the gentry class were able to afford equipment and facilities and whatnot, but the lower classes wouldn't have been able to. And then the time available. I mean, this really kind of has an impact on post-industrial revolution, so during the creation of factories. But if we think during this period of time, there would have been more time to play, but it would have still occurred, on the influence of the church in particular. Okay, so what we're going to do for the rest of the lesson really is focus on some diagrams, some pictures that are going to come up, and I just want you to annotate them. I want you to kind of label them and decide which sport is being shown, decide which you think it would suit. Did it suit the lower classes or the upper class? So you can see an example here of sort of prize fighting, boxing, and the actual boxers themselves would have been lower class peasants. And then people around, you can see in the pictures sort of towards the back, you can tell by the fact that they're wearing their top hats and sort of nicer sort of clothing. They would have been the people that, they would have been the upper class, but ultimately they would have been watching, they would have been wagering, they would have been betting on these kind of activities. And then some of the details really, so you could just sort of label the fact that this is kind of a cramped space. It may have happened underground, for example. And obviously you can see there's a ref and a judge. Or is there a ref and a judge? I've put there that there's no sighting of a ref and a judge. The person on the left-hand side looks a little bit like a referee, but perhaps not. Perhaps he was an owner to one of the peasants. And obviously, where did it take place? So just thinking about that. So just want you to pause the video now, and I just want you to sort of just go through picture by picture and make some notes. Okay, so hopefully you've gone through and looked at the various pictures and you've labelled them and made some notes on them. So you can see here, obviously, this is kind of looks like lawn tennis, and you can tell that the people sitting down are sat on sort of sophisticated chairs. Looks like it's outdoors. It might be in someone's back garden, and obviously that would have been taken place by the upper class, okay, the gentry, and you can sort of see by sort of what they're wearing. Again, the use of different equipment. He's got a racket. And so on. So lawn tennis, and you can sort of see the woman on the left-hand side of the screen dressed in a nice dress. And again, it would have been the upper class taking part in this type of activity. Again, we've got sort of prize fighting here, and we can see sort of real lower classes, perhaps the peasants themselves doing the fighting, and interestingly enough, the two that are inside the rope, the two with the top hats there on either side, the left and the right, they may have been the patrons. And what I mean by patrons is they may have owned the actual peasants. So we kind of refer to that nowadays as like the agents. And ultimately, from that, whoever wins this fight, the rewards may go to that particular patron, that agent of that particular peasant, and the peasant may get, some food, may get something as a reward for winning that particular fight as well. And then you can see sort of behind, again, a mixture of kind of upper class and lower classes maybe watching this type of event. Again, we've got an example here of real tennis, and I think on the YouTube clip that I've asked you to watch as part of the flip learning, you'll be able to see that in a little bit more detail, again in regards to kind of what they're wearing, the equipment, and also just the fact that they've got this facility that they can play on and in. And in the background, interestingly enough, you can sort of see the two people there. They might be the lower class peasants who are the servants, who are maybe doing some farm work of some sort, who aren't taking part in the activity itself, but being told what to do on the particular gentry's land. Okay, this example here is a common feature for sort of the upper class gentry class, and again, as I said about influences of the military, you can see there, the archery board at the front, and they would have taken part in these kind of festivals in grand spots and places. And you can see their stately home at the background, and then sort of in the middle, you can actually see some horses, and again, they would have had horse racing perhaps going on, and it would have been a grand occasion. With marquees, as you can see there as well. So that's definitely the upper class, the gentry class taking part in something there. This is an example of pedestrianism, which is kind of like speed walking in essence. And again, this would have been sort of taken part by the lower classes, and the upper classes would have probably watched. Again, they may have had patrons who would have owned those peasants to take part in this particular activity. But again, you can sort of see the differences in terms of what they are wearing. But that's pedestrianism, as it's referred to as. This is an example of fighting. And in essence, we have, animals fighting against one another. And this was kind of quite popular among the gentry class. And you can sort of see those sitting around. This eventually became banned and was as sort of a form of sort of underground activities really that was illegal, and eventually got turned into an underground activity. But you can see there sort of in terms of what they're wearing, that was the gentry class. This is an example of mob football, and you can see sort of what I mean by sort of it being chaotic. You can see examples of just the general public playing, climbing on lampposts. You can see in the background the church, and I think that's important to note as well, because like I said, this would have taken place in village town squares and so on and so forth, but ultimately people at times could have died because it was violent and so on, but it was chaotic. An example here, gentry, fox hunting, the use of the horse and so on. And then finally cricket, again, upper classes as well. So I'm hoping that you'll get some ideas in terms of the differences between the two classes there.